Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, and the Blue Fairy has been working overtime this year. We've had not one, but two Pinocchio kind of remake adaptations. Guillermo del Toro's Netflix one just dropped. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So earlier this year, Disney released kind of straight to Disney Plus, kind of a live action / weird hybrid animated kind of remake of Pinocchio. Arguably one of the worst movies of the year. I was not a fan of that, although all the Pinocchio fans came out of the woodworks to defend at least the original kind of cartoon, kind of bizarre Disney classic. So Del Toro now he's kind of taking his crack to carve this sort of old ancient story into something that's interesting, and it is definitely intentional that his name is in the title of this movie, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio. I don't think it's just to kind of a convenient way to distinguish it from all the other adaptations that there seems to be, but this is a Del Toro movie really from start to finish, kind of his imagination and kind of storytelling, darker sensibilities kind of color this whole movie from the opening to the end, and make it kind of an interesting film to get into. I don't think this one kind of resists some of the conversations of like, is it good, is it bad, kind of the real simplistic, because I think kind of what people feel about this movie in a lot of ways is going to depend on like what they want from it, what they expected, what kind of how they engage with it. And so it's kind of about this. The story itself, obviously, it's sharing kind of the same source material, the same kind of the myth, the legend of Pinocchio as the Disney film. So it does have a lot of obvious overlap and familiar story elements that are kind of sprinkled throughout. So like it still kind of echoes the story that we all know from like the Disney version. Although this is also a drastically different tale. It's a much different take, both in like the way it's constructed and presented, and also just in the plot. Hey, if you don't remember the scene where Pinocchio gets shot with a pistol and dies after insulting Mussolini with a song about poop, then you're not alone. You don't find that scene in the Disney movie. This thing gets weird. This thing gets bizarre. This is, like I said, a Del Toro movie, and I don't think his sort of vision is going to connect with everyone. I think actually it might repel a lot of people. Just aren't buying what he's giving. But kind of on the surface, though, what this movie can't be accused of is this a simple, kind of tired retread. There's definitely kind of a lot of unique and original stuff added to this movie to make it kind of stand out among all these other adaptations. I think probably the one element in this movie that won't be divisive and that I think anyone can agree on is that just visually, this movie is a complete treat. This thing is great. The stop motion is, again, I'm a fan of stop motion. And you can just see like the care and the love really in like every single frame of this thing. This thing is definitely made with a lot of care. And I think unlike the Disney version, which really kind of had an identity crisis of like, is it live action? But like, Pinocchio is CGI, and a lot of the creatures are CGI, so it's still kind of animated, although Geppetto was Tom Hanks, and just sort of didn't really know what this movie was trying to be. Del Toro's Pinocchio absolutely has a very distinct and kind of clear identity, both with like the storytelling, but especially with like the stop motion visuals, which are just beautiful and well done. To kind of lean up to this film, some of like the interviews and stuff, Del Toro kind of expressed that this movie was made primarily for the audience of himself. This wasn't necessarily a movie that he was kind of purposely trying to make and aim for children. And having seen this movie, his nose will not be growing. There are no lies told in that statement. This is definitely kind of a darker and almost a pessimistic, cynical story, although it does have some kind of hopeful elements in it. But it just sort of paints this like melancholy picture, kind of this worldview that, life's just, hey, it's a hard life. There's suffering, there's grief, there's loss. Kind of the best you can hope for is just to do your best, kind of make the most of it as you kind of go through it. And it wrestles with, and we'll get into that in just a moment, but it wrestles with mature adult themes, and it doesn't have a whole lot of like whimsy or humor to kind of to lighten the mood. And just the aesthetic, it almost has like a Tim Burton aesthetic. I know it's still very distinct to Del Toro, but it has a sort of a darker tone to it. Like I said, Pinocchio dies not once, several times, and each time he dies, he kind of goes to like this like underworld afterlife, and there's like these like skeleton rabbits, and he's like in a coffin, and he gets sent back after talking to the guardian. This like the story itself is set kind of in like a fascist Italy and kind of in the past, like the backdrop of war, and like instead of him going to like Pleasure Island and becoming a donkey, kind of that iconic moment. In this version, he's sort of conscripted into sort of the like fascist youth army and trained to be a soldier. So kind of all throughout, definitely a far more kind of adult and like gritty or mature take on the story. As far as things like content to consider, things going on in the surface of this movie, there's no direct swearing, but there's maybe just a handful of kind of like rude or like placeholder words. Like someone says "bugger off" or says like "freaking," or the cricket says "gosh darn it." But again, no like actual profanity in this. Sexuality, there's no sexuality. Violence, there's a little bit of violence. Obviously, like I said, Pinocchio dies, and some like the imagery of that. Obviously, he's a puppet and he comes back. But you see that kind of gun violence, and like he's run over by a car. So you kind of have some of that. And there's a scene where when he's sort of in that like, youth army conscripted, where the group is playing kind of like some war games, and like they're using paint, so like no harm is done to them, but just like the visuals of that I think are intentionally somewhat graphic, like, kind of red paint splattering on the face of a kid who gets shot. It's paint, not blood, but obviously it's reminiscence of sort of the horrors of war. And this characters die. There's bombs. This is set in the backdrop of war. One of the villains has a bomb land on him, doesn't make it out of this movie. So there's sort of some violence, and I think also the carnival master, who kind of returns, although in a slightly different form for this movie. He kind of like physically abuses a bit, like his sort of pet monkey, and also Pinocchio. Some of that is a little maybe disturbing and violent. A couple other elements as far as content go. Spirituality, obviously the Blue Fairy is a spirit. She's like in the original, although in this version, she's kind of talked about as like the spirit of the forest, and she's like introduced these like creepy eyes things that are floating through the forest, and they kind of come together to make this spirit. And like I said too, there's sort of the like purgatorial afterlife kind of place that Pinocchio goes, where these like kind of skeletal rabbit creatures are, and so you have that are sort of like the minions of the guardian of the sort of this purgatory place, who isn't necessarily depicted as like an evil creature, just sort of in charge of sort of the dead. So you have some of that, although like a lot of it is like kind of fantastical, sort of like fairies and spirits and stuff that's for this tale. There's also kind of a surprisingly like front and center like Catholicism in this. Several of the scenes in this take place in a church where Geppetto has been kind of commissioned to carve a crucifix. Actually, one of the opening lines of the whole movie is Geppetto praying, where he prays, to the Father, to the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And there's even a kind of which I found as a profound moment in this, where Pinocchio has kind of been mistreated by people that in the church that kind of accuse him as like he's demonic or witchcraft or the work of the devil. They don't know how to take him. And kind of later, he's in this church, and he's looking at the crucifix, and kind of says like, I still have a question, like, who is this guy? Like, this is still made of wood as a crucifix, and people seem to love him. Why don't people love me? I'm kind of just sort of throwing out this question as far as the church loved Jesus, but they didn't necessarily love the people with the love of Jesus. So you do get kind of that kind of more like real world Christian spirituality that is also kind of in here alongside some of the more fantastical stuff. And maybe lastly, there is Geppetto kind of in his grief. He gets drunk in a scene, and I think he's shown drinking a couple of times. And there is another character that's like smoking kind of a cigarette, just real briefly in a scene. So as far as content, there is some stuff kind of throughout, although none of it, unless like the spiritual stuff is sort of off-putting to you. I didn't find any content-wise super concerning. As far as themes kind of going on beneath the surface of this thing, kind of in several ways, Del Toro approaches this in a very subversive, almost like a reaction to the Disney cartoon, because a lot of the themes or the way that it's approached or explored almost come out across as like the opposite of the way that Disney presented it, and kind of maybe in two main ways. The first one is this sort of original sin, kind of in the Disney version. Pinocchio is sort of kind of the whole story works as like a morality tale that Pinocchio is just sort of this selfish kind of ignorant person, and kind of throughout his journey and overcoming temptations, he has to like learn to control sort of his selfishness and not give in to the temptation in Pleasure Island, and kind of by the end come to a place where he's overcome his sort of sinful nature. And that's sort of like what Jiminy Cricket is, he's assigned to him to be his conscience, help him grow and kind of develop this like moral sense. Where Del Toro kind of takes a bit of the opposite approach to that, where Pinocchio is sort of, he's naive and he still has some like childlike tendencies, but he's presented a lot more sort of innocent and pure, and kind of throughout the story, rather than like the circumstances teaching him how to be more moral and kind of overcome sin. It's almost like the world corrupts sort of this innocent creature that's more like the outside kind of societal pressure rather than like an internal kind of original sin. So biblically, I don't know if it necessarily lines up or at least works in the same kind of metaphorical sense with like kind of Romans 5 and like original sin entering the world. Although maybe it does fall in line more with something like Mark 10, where Jesus kind of says, unless you come to me as a child, kind of like, hey, the kids have it right. They're the pure ones. We sort of corrupt things. So I do think there's some stuff in there. Maybe kind of the other theme in this is just sort of the idea of like obedience and control, and like whether that's a good thing, whether that's a bad thing. Like I said, the original Pinocchio was sort of like a moral kind of didactic thing about kind of learning to obey the rules and learning to like obey Geppetto as his father, and not sort of be swept up and led astray by kind of breaking the rules. Del Toro, and even in some of the interviews kind of leading up to this, like intentionally wanted to kind of push back about that, kind of against that mindset, saying, okay, maybe obedience isn't always a good thing. Maybe it's not always virtue. And this film kind of explores maybe more of the kind of the abuse of it, because there's sort of this underlying theme all throughout this thing about kind of how the world wants to kind of create puppets. It wants to kind of put strings on people and like control people and kind of manipulate them. And even like the Pinocchio, when he's first like unveiled to the public, the first question that he's asked by someone is, if you're a puppet, where are your strings? Who controls you, wooden boy? And that whole theme of control really runs almost throughout every element of this movie. And Pinocchio kind of has like three kind of paternal father authority figures that kind of come and go throughout the story. Geppetto, then the carnival master, then there's sort of like a government military leader that kind of conscripts him. And kind of all three of them throughout this are sort of fighting over control of Pinocchio. There's even like, they visualize that very overtly, where two of the characters are like having tug of war, saying, hey, he's my puppet. No, he's my puppet. Kind of trying to pull him back and forth, kind of gain control of it. And I know sometimes the theme of like disobedience is not necessarily one that like parents are super excited for. I don't think this is a film that like encourages the value of just disobeying, being a rebel. But I do think it's designed to kind of show that the way that we sort of can abuse control and power and kind of use that as like a tool, and like the way that children can kind of get lost in the shuffle of that. So I do think there's some interesting kind of complex themes that as Christians, and just as all people, I think could be valuable to kind of work through. So in the end, I kind of hesitate to say that this isn't suitable for children, because I think children are brilliant. They can handle a lot more mature themes than I think adults give them credit for. But I do think that this is clearly a film that's not. It doesn't go out of its way to make itself easily accessible to children. It deals with complex themes, kind of meditates on grief, and doesn't always give like simple didactic answers in the way that like the original one was very clearly sort of this morality story. It deals with spiritual themes. It deals with kind of abuse. It deals with political things. I think there's a lot of stuff in there. And I think from that sense, this is a well kind of crafted work of art. It's a challenging thing. I think maybe as like a potential selection for like family movie night, that maybe some families might need to choose a different movie, although still not the Disney remake, but because it is more mature and serious than maybe you're used to with this story. But hey, if you guys check this out, it's on Netflix right now. We'd love to hear what you thought, whether if you enjoyed it or enjoyed the elements of it like I did, if you loved the stop motion, or if you just found it kind of a little too pessimistic and a little too dark for what you want from a Pinocchio movie. Jump in the comment sections and let me know I'll encourage you guys too, if you guys haven't done so, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. Got lots of movie reviews, got Avatar coming out next week, and got live streams. So this, love to have you be a part of it. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.